the superficial and hypocritical nature of the public adulation paid him by the multitudes. In other words, Jesus didn't have any trouble drawing a crowd, and kind of a worshipful crowd almost, because everywhere he went, he was doing miracles. Listen, on Tuesday of the Passion Week, when each group of his enemies was coming and trying to catch him in his words and offering him up and hatefully trying to destroy him, in between those confrontations, he was doing miracles. He was healing people. I mean, but at any rate, and here is his strategy. So my point is, he got crowds, but in many cases, that the what seemed to be a willingness to accept him was very, very selfish and superficial. And so to test the genuineness of what seemed to be a willingness to accept him, he would speak hard words. And what I mean by that is words which, if obeyed, would be costly. Not hard in the sense of hard to understand, but he does this again and again, and I'm going to give you an illustration, and that is the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I'll just warn you that everybody who teaches on the Sermon on the Mount is convinced he understands it better than anybody else, and I'm probably no exception, so forgive me for that. And remember this, that because the Sermon on the Mount is often taken as Jesus somehow describing the age to come. That is, what the gospel would look like after he departed for a season. But remember this, that the only question, Bible interpretation, exegesis, trying to understand what it means, when you're reading the Bible, this is what I tell people. If you sit down and open the Bible and read and ask yourself, what does this mean to me? Shame on you. You ask, what does it mean? And what it means has to do with what the original author meant the original reader, or the original speaker meant the original hearer to say. That's the only question. What does it mean? There's one meaning, and that meaning is what the author, the speaker, intended when he first wrote it to his audience. Now, if you figure out the meaning, and you should, and you get up and ask yourself, well, you get up without asking yourself, what does this mean to me? Shame on you all over again. That makes sense to you? But you start with, what does it mean? Honestly, does that make sense? So the only question you're allowed to ask, if you don't mind, if you're trying to understand the meaning of a text, one meaning, many applications, one meaning, and the only question you ask is, what was he saying to that audience on that day? Well, the Sermon on the Mount is a good illustration of what I'm talking about, because now the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew 5-7, and again, I think it's the same passage, it's the same event in Luke 6. But the point is that there had been a season of miracle working, and many had come and been healed by Jesus, and Jesus was heartbroken because he realized that they were rebellious, they were as sheep refusing their shepherd. That's how I understand it. But he goes up on a mountain, and he calls his disciples to himself. And by the way, I said earlier that forgot to start the timer. A lot of good that does. No, that's not working well. No, just go with the time.
I can move that rock right behind you. You're almost.
That's a good idea. Safety first.
That's good.
I'm out of emergency.
If you fall down and break a leg, don't come running me. Anyway, so the point is, I mentioned before that the Pharisees were revered by the people. And what happened is, Jesus, I was going to say too, that the most important, the person that got the greatest respect in the Jewish world was a rabbi. And the way to be a rabbi is to have disciples, those who have committed to learning and so on. And so when you would teach as a rabbi, you would call your disciples to yourself, and they would sit sort of in a ring at your feet. And that was so here comes Jesus. He goes up on a hillside. Now, in the Bible, mountains are hills. They're not even very high hills, to be honest with you. But he goes up the Sermon on the Mount. It's just a hillside. And I can take you there where it happened. And on that hillside, it's a hillside that's shaped like a sounding board. So it provides its remarkable acoustical properties, natural. But he would go up, part way up the hill, not all the way to the top, because if he did that, he would lose his, his voice would go over the hill. So at any rate, And Jesus calls his disciples to himself. So all these people who are there, and so many of them have been healed, there's a great deal of excitement. When they watch Jesus go up there and sit in a rock and have his disciples sit down, they'd say, shh, shh, the rabbi's going to speak, he's going to teach. That's exactly what he does. And he calls them to attention. And then you have the Beatitudes. I'd love to talk to you about them, but what I'm after, I think you remember the Sermon on the Mount probably, because what happens then is you have Jesus say again and again, you have heard it said of old. And some people, and I think erroneously, think that he's referring to the Old Testament, that the Old Testament said this, but I'm teaching you something different. Jesus never put distance between himself and the Old Testament. And Earl Ellis, scholar, has a nice article where he makes the point that that's a well-known phrase. You have heard it said of old, it has often been said. And it's never used of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's always used of rabbinical teachings. And I like to say that if you want to appreciate the Sermon on the Mount, you have to picture Jesus pointing. I wasn't there, I don't know for sure, but I like to think of him as pointing. Because here you got the crowd, and way over here you got this little gaggle of Pharisees, and they're madder than hops, and you can see a Pharisee a mile off, their blue is bluer, and their fringe is longer, and their turbans are high. So they're over here, and they're mad. And I think Jesus is saying, you have heard it said of old, but I say unto you. And he does it again and again. Everything Jesus says is absolutely consonant or consistent with the Old Testament. At one point he says, they say unto you, you shouldn't have adultery. I say unto you, if you look upon a woman. Who said that first? Do you remember who said, I have made a covenant with my eyes? And if I look upon another woman, it's Job. He's just repeating what Job, the earliest writer in the Old Testament, perhaps said. That makes sense to you? So Jesus is not, he's putting distance between them. And then when he gets to the end, now think of this. So this is what I'm saying. All these people seem willing to follow Jesus. And Jesus, and the other dynamic you need to say, you understand, Jesus is going to put the most deliberate distance between himself and the Pharisees. But wait, the Pharisees were revered by the people. See, the Pharisees, I'd love to talk about this one. The Pharisees were full-time, 24/7 law keepers. Now, when I say law keepers, it wasn't just that they were keeping the Mosaic law, but they were keeping all the traditions. And so they had surrounded the Mosaic law, noble as it is, important as it is, legitimate, but they had surrounded with all these man-made, they called them offspring laws, so there's the parent, but these are, or fence laws, F-E-N-C-E. So the Bible says don't work on the Sabbath. But lest you be a little careless and not realize what work is, we're going to make fence laws. So we all these, in a Jewish home to this day, as I understand, I've never seen it happen, but Orthodox, on Friday afternoon, the children go to the drawer, and it's got a number of black little cloths in it, and they take those cloths and they drape them over every mirror in the house before the sun goes down on Friday. Because their thought is that if we leave the mirrors uncovered, one of the women in the house might pass by, see a gray hair, inadvertently pluck it, and that would be reaping. And so they would cover their mirrors. I mean, just and it was like every day you had to come up with something new. Now, the point is that the Pharisees taught explicitly that the way to be confident of the kingdom, you and I think of heaven, we ought to kind of rethink it. We are headed for a kingdom, a messianic kingdom on this earth. But they taught the way to be confident of the kingdom is to keep the law, and to keep the law more carefully, and to keep not so much the Mosaic law, but the tradition of the elders. And that's how, and the thing about it is, this is important. You couldn't give yourself 24/7 to working at these things. And so the idea was that if you support, because the Pharisees didn't work, they never had a job, they never had a trade, their whole life was just studying and keeping the law. But if you supported them with your alms and so on, then you could ride their coattails into the kingdom. Not only were they certain to get into the kingdom, but you could ride their coattail. Now insinuate that into what I'm telling you. So here's Jesus, and he's got these people, he's healed so many of them, but they're totally devoted to the Pharisees. And so what is Jesus going to do? He's going to put, now he stands here and he says, and you remember when he gets, well, I'm thinking awful, you have this same dynamic in my mind, which in Matthew 23 on Tuesday the Passion Week, when Jesus calls down the curses on the Pharisees. Woe unto you, Pharisees and scribes, hypocrites. Listen, Pharisee was a fraternity. It was a loose fraternity given to law keeping. Scribes that was a guild. That was a profession. You were copies, right? We've been carefully trained. I have a good friend. We get to Israel sometime. I'll introduce you to him. His name is Eli, and he's a Torah scribe, and he'll explain to you all of it. But anyway, the point is that most of the scribes, because what they did is give themselves a copy of Scripture. And the Pharisees loved the Scripture. The Sadducees, remember, they didn't even believe it. But so the point is that the Pharisees and scribes are joined at the hip. So now in Matthew 23, Jesus saying, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. But come way back to the Sermon on the Mount, same thing here. Because imagine now that all these people, and they're excited. They're willing to follow Jesus. They're saying, oh man, look, he just healed my daughter. I think maybe he is Messiah. And then Jesus stands here and points at the Pharisees and says, they say unto you, but I say unto you. They say unto you, but I say unto you. Remember how he concludes. There's a broad gate. Many go in. And I got thing and pointed. You can get where there's a narrow way. You can build your house on the sand if you want, but it's going to be destroyed. Or you can build a house on the rock. Now, all I want you to catch is that as you read the Gospels, look for this again and again. Jesus does that in Nazareth. When after he had the passage we looked at last night in Luke chapter 4, where after he had read the scriptures and said, this day is fulfilled, and then he went on to say, to his, and remember, he grew up in that town. He knew that town well. And this is Luke chapter 4. Are you with me on this? I'm flying low here, But in Luke chapter 4, what he does is he says, remember this, there were many lepers in Israel in the days of, what'd you start off with them? Hold on here. I think that's the second one. Oh, there were many widows in the days of Elijah, but God sent Elijah to a Syrophoenician widow. And there were many lepers in the days of Elisha, but God sent Elisha, God healed by Elisha, he healed a Syrian leper. What's the next thing that happens, remember? His townspeople try and throw him off a cliff. They gather him up, we're going to throw him off a cliff. Well, what's at stake there is this. Nazareth, and this is where it's important to understand some of the geography. Nazareth was, it sat on a ridge called the Nazareth Ridge. That's pretty easy. And it looked right down on the Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley was the most important crossroads, trade crossroads in the ancient world. Most important. Nothing like it anywhere in the world. And so the Romans had to monitor traffic, and they had a huge, one of the primary passes into the Jezreel Valley is the Megiddo Pass. And the Megiddo Pass has forever been guarded by a city called Megiddo that sits on a hill. And the Aramaic word for hill is Har. So that's Har Megiddo, that's Armageddon. And the point is that'll play a role in the future, but it was always important. The largest Roman army base ever found in Israel, besides in Jerusalem, was found there in Megiddo on the plain of the valley. But then up here at Nazareth, where they could look down, was a smaller but very important outpost of Roman soldiers. And Nazareth, the Nazarenes had to live with those Roman soldiers. Most of them were mercenaries. They didn't speak the language. They had a sword on their side. It was dangerous. And so I think the point is that the Nazarenes, and Jesus knew it, the Nazarenes hated the Gentiles, hated the Romans. And it's wrong to hate the Romans. And so Jesus, having proclaimed himself as Messiah, the first thing he said, okay, this is what I like to say. He had a habit of putting his finger on the most raw spiritual nerve in your psyche and saying, this is where I'm going to ask you to submit. Not to be mean, but to test your allegiance. This is where. So on the Sermon on the Mount, it's the Pharisees. They were the perfect foil. You're not going to have me and them. So if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to reject them, and it's going to cost you something. Same thing in Nazareth. If you're really going to accept me as your Messiah, you're going to have to repent of your wicked hatred of the Roman people, specifically of the soldiers. That makes sense? All right, so I'm going to leave it. I'm just going to say that That's a dynamic that is very, very underappreciated, and I think it's quite clear. Now, drop down to number 8, and I say there, Jesus remained a wildly popular folk hero, the object of almost universal popular fascination, and that's the word I like. I think you ask, well, how would you describe the response of the nation to Jesus when he came? And I would say they were fascinated. He was the best show in town. Did they really bow the knee to his claims? No, as it turns out, they didn't. But he certainly was a wildly popular folk hero. And I say that popularity crescendoed until it imploded climatically on Tuesday, the Passion Week. Next year we can go through that perhaps. And this enduring and increasing popular fascination impacted Jesus' ministry in 3 ways. Number 1, this is important, it deceived the apostles. When Jesus began to speak about dying, all they could think of was that he was wildly popular. You remember in the parables, and again, there's a lot done with the parables that I think is invaluable. But the first parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 13 is the sower who went forth to sow. And I know that there are a lot of, that's describing the course of the gospel in this age. Listen, the disciples to whom he was speaking, he told that parable in public, but he interpreted it in private. They had no idea that Jesus was going to go away, that he was going to be gone. It was just entirely unthinkable and foreign to us, as you can imagine. And so that's not what Jesus, what's going on there is, I'll just leave it at this. What Jesus is saying is, all right, let me back up a little bit. That parable, all right, that Matthew 13, I like to say, comes right after Matthew 12. Write that down. The point being that, and it was the same day. It's what's called Jesus' busy day. So in the morning, he had worked that miracle we talked about this morning where he healed a man who was blind and dumb. And the people had said to the Pharisees, he's not the son of David, right? Help us out here. We've decided that you're right, but we don't know what to do with that miracle. And the Pharisees come up with a Beelzebub explanation, as wicked as it is, and the people, that's good enough for us. So my point is that this morning, Jesus realized, on the basis of the reaction of those people, that his popularity was crumbling, that the people were not going to be the kind of protection that he needed for much longer. Does that make sense to you? So Jesus is wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. So what happens is, later that day, Jesus calls them, gets the attention of the multitudes, and he said, I want to tell you a story. And he told the story of the sower. Now the curious thing about that story is, I don't know how else to say it, there's nothing to it. If I were to say to you, all right, here's my parallel. Man got up one morning, had breakfast, got in his car, went to work. Had a good day at work. That afternoon he came home, had some supper, read a book, and that night he went to bed. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. What are you going to do with that story? That's just, and the same thing, man went out to sow. That's exactly. There was never a man who went out to sow. But some of it fell on the road, and some of it in shallow, and some of it in thorny, and some of it did well. There's absolutely nothing instructive about, well, there is. And remember that Jesus, and what happens is, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, what are you doing? Why are you teaching this way? And Jesus says, because to you, I got to tell you something about the kingdom program of God that you never could have anticipated. And to you, it's given to understand this mysterious new truth, but to them, it's not given. And so he adopted a teaching method which confused. He says, to those who have the truth, I'm going to give more, but to those who don't have it, I'm going to take away what they got. That makes sense to you? It was what? But so what is he teaching? What is the point of the sower? I think all that Jesus is saying is this, and I started out down this road by saying that when Jesus spoke of dying, it was incoherent. It was incongruous is the word I want. It was incongruous to the disciples because he was so wildly popular. And so when he tells that parable, he says, now you've watched people, you've probably done it yourself, you sowed grain, and some of it fell on on a road, and it was immediately like, okay, that's the Pharisees, that got carried off. But some of it fell on thorny soil, and it came up, and it was really encouraging. Then as soon as there was sun, as soon as there were thorns, it withered. But some of it did well. What's Jesus saying? Very simply, he's saying to those disciples, gentlemen, this is not going nearly as well as you think. You think we're on a roll here, but in point of fact, just to think about a man who goes out to sow. And there's a lot of shallow and thorny soil out there, and it's going to prove itself. Now, what am I saying to you? I'm saying that by reason of his wild-eyed popularity, his disciples simply struggled with the idea that he was going to be rejected. It made no sense. Right up until the Passion Week. Secondly, I'm saying it had three impacts. Secondly, it protected Jesus. And that's what we talked about before. Be on your sheet there by means of the... No, I'm in the wrong place. It enabled Jesus to escape the murderous hatred of his enemies. They wanted to take him, but they could not. It's such an important dynamic. And folks, I occasionally suck things out of my stomach, if you don't mind, but I'm not, okay? I'm not making this up. This is explicit in the text. They wanted to take him, but they could not because they feared the multitude. And that was carefully nurtured by and utilized. And then thirdly, it made it necessary to get the Romans involved in the crucifixion. Now, I'm going to pick that up. Let me deal with one more, and that is number 9. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, that throughout his ministry, but especially it becomes so dramatic in the narrative as the Passion approaches, he demonstrated himself to be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. And I mentioned this last night, but I'll just, once again, this is Matthew 10 and verse 16. It's the sending out of the 12. And what the verse says is, behold, I am sending you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, you must be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And a simple, but I think slightly flawed reading of that verse would suggest that the therefore has to do with the sheep and the wolves. You know, I'm saying sheep in the midst of wolves, and therefore, but the Greek won't allow it. The Greek is constructed in such a way it makes very clear what the emphasis is. And so it would be better understood this way. I'm the one sending you in the midst of sheep and wolves, and therefore you must be who I am. You must reflect who I am, and you must be wise as serpents. And I said it this morning. The word means clever. You know, not very many of you. But any of you ever watched the old Mission Impossible with Jim Phelps? And we used to love that. We had a little black and white TV, and it was on Sunday night. We'd come running home after this, you know, the church service, and turn around and sit there and watch Jim Phelps. Now, the point is that the later the movies that Cruise did, they missed the point entirely. But the point is, I love this intricate plots. They have intricate plots and involve 16 different things, and it all come out, and everything worked fine. They get in that black van and drive off, and the music can come up, you know, and Bruce Keller. But my point is, I kind of enjoy that. That's not a point at all. But the reason I mention it is because there is so much of that in Jesus' life. He is so clever. And he has to be, folks, he has to be, he says, you must be like me, wise as a serpent. Think about that. Did the Bible ever talk about a serpent and wisdom? You know, the point, remember in Genesis 3, the serpent was wise. And so the point is, you got to outsmart Satan. Now, you're going to depend upon the Spirit to give guidance and open doors and so on, but you got to work at it. We have no right to be careless about the resources that God gives us for ministry. We got to just frame your ministry so that you utilize every resource, you put the enemy at every disadvantage and so on. That's what Jesus is saying, and he was a master at it. Now, I give you a couple of ways in which that's the case, and I'm going to return to this next year, but I thought it would just be a good and a healthy place to kind of conclude this, because I say, first of all, the raising of Lazarus that set the scene for the second cleansing of the temple and so on. Oh, I'd love to talk to you about all of that. But there's one dynamic of Jesus' ministry. I'm going to leave the notes. And that is, it's fascinating to see in the narrative, to watch how Jesus carried himself carefully so that the Romans he would be put to death by the Romans and not by the Jews. Now, the point is that 3 times in the Gospel of John, matter of fact, let's take the time to look at it. The first one is in John 3, and Jesus says, this is a familiar verse, John 3, I think it's verse 14, see if I'm going to look at it. But Jesus, in a conversation with Nicodemus, he says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That's kind of a cryptic verse, but I think the meaning becomes quite clear. But notice the word must. Now the next one is in John 8. I'm going to find it right here and save myself. John 8 and verse 28. So I'll go there this way. Here's John 8 and verse 28. And this is at the Feast of Tabernacles. And Jesus has been accused, his enemies, primarily the Pharisees, are saying the Feast of Tabernacles is 6 months before Jesus dies. Just for John 7 and 9, it's about the Feast of Tabernacles. So we're 6 months from the Passover at which he'll die. But his enemies, the Pharisees, are accused. He said, you're not speaking for the Father. And he says, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am, and I don't think that he should be there. I think he is saying, I am definitely speaking for the Father, that I do nothing of myself as my Father taught me. I speak these things. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you'll know dead certain that he is speaking for the Father. And the third one is in John chapter 12. And he says, I'll be lazy here. John chapter 12. And this is in that marvelous passage. It's Tuesday of the Passion Week. And Jesus is he's on the Temple Mount, and some Greeks have come and said we would see Jesus, and Jesus has spoken about his death. But then he says this. He says, I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. Now, so John 3, even so must the Son of Man lift up. John 8, when he is lifted up, then you'll know that I'm speaking of the Father. And John 12, if I am lifted up, then I will draw him into myself. Now, I know, and I've heard this often, that the idea of being lifted up is to praise him. If we lift him up, honor him, praise him, that'll draw him in. Well, that might be a happy thought, but I'll guarantee you that's not what John is talking about, because happily enough, right here in John chapter 12, verse 33, after he said, if I am lifted up, then I'll draw people, then John, the apostle, the author of the gospel, stops and he gives us an insight. He says, this he said, signifying by what death he would die. Now, we might have expected that he would die at the hands of the Jews by crucifixion, but Jesus says 3 times it is imperative that I die by being lifted up. The reference is to crucifixion. I can take you one more, because in John 18, when he is taken, there it is. John 18, and this is very early on Friday, and Jesus is being taken from the Sanhedrists. They've got him to confess aloud that he is the Christ. Yeah, Bob.
Maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding was that the Jewish religious authorities had no authority to kill or perpetrate capital punishment and crucifixion.
No, you're exactly right, and it's in this passage in John 18. You're exactly right.
And a public method. They only the Romans would.
They needed the Romans. And that's why, and I think this is, I'll go back to the narrative, but you're exactly right. And what happens is, the Jewish authorities, having gotten Jesus to confess that he is open, see, their problem is what I talked about this morning, that he never used the word Messiah of himself, and they couldn't find anybody who would confess that, oh, for sure, I heard him say it. So they had no case to be made, and so finally Caiaphas interrogates illegally. It's by Jewish law, you can't do this, but he puts Jesus under oath, and he says, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? And he said, I am. Absolutely right. Thou sayest. It's exactly as you say. So now the Sanhedrinists figure they got him, so they're going to bring him to Pilate. They bring him to Pilate, and Pilate, as judge, he says, what's the charge? And they say, if he weren't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him to you. And he says, well, then you go try him yourself. And they say, you know that we can't put him to death. And therefore, it was imperative that they get the Romans involved. So, But now what happens is that when they say that, it's right here, as a matter of fact, John 18, when they say that, I'm in verse 31. Can you see that? Pilate said to them, listen, I'm going to do something here as long as I'm reading to you. So, verse 31, Pilate said to them, when they said, he says, you take him and judge him according to your law, and they say it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And here's my point. Look at in the green. In order that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. All right, now let me make it simple. But what's at stake here, I believe, is this: that for some reason it was imperative that Jesus die not by stoning at the hands of the Jews, but by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. And so he maintained this popularity, and he confessed to the Sanhedrinists that, in point of fact, now the plot had been laid on Tuesday night. The Sanhedrinists had gone to Pilate and laid this whole plot that in connection with the Passover feast, we're going to get him arrested. We'll seize him in the absence of the multitude, and then we will bring him to you. But we got to have it. So now they bring him, and the point is that I think it's fair to say that Jesus was careful to carry himself in such a way that, because there are several times where the Jews pick up the stones to stone him, but because they're so angry with him, especially John chapter 8, where he says, I and the Father are one, John 10. And so here's my point, that what we have in the scriptures from the lips of Jesus is that it was imperative to die by being lifted up. What John tells us is he was talking about the type of death he would die. And we're told by Jesus that he must be lifted up. If he is lifted up, all men will know he speaks for the Father. And if I am lifted up, I'll draw men to myself. All right, so here's a question. And it's a question which is not explicitly answered in the scriptures, and there are various answers. I'm going to give you mine. I like mine best. But honest to goodness, I think what's at stake is this. Why was it imperative that Jesus die by being lifted up?
So he rise.
Pardon me?
So he can run. So he can rise.
But that was death. But specific type of death was by crucifixion.
Fulfilling prophecy?
Well, there are prophecies to be sure, but I don't think he manipulates himself. I think the prophecy anticipates what's going to happen as opposed to Jesus manipulating. Some people think because then his bones wouldn't be broken and the lamb had to be. I think there's more to it, and I'm just going to suggest this to you. As I said before, the Romans had taken an ancient means of execution and they had fine-tuned it brutally, gruesomely, but deliberately. Because, again, it was primarily for seditionists, and it was not about executing the seditionists, but about putting down the sedition. And therefore, Romans, we'll talk about this next year, but they demanded that crucifixion, number one, be cruel beyond what we can really appreciate, just publicly. Well, and secondly, it had to be lingering. They didn't want him to die quickly on the cross. And that's why, by the way, there was always some sort of apparatus, and now we think we know what it is. There was always some discussion. But there was an apparatus by which the man could hoist himself up. Because once you're crucified, within a few minutes, your rib cage settles in on your breathing apparatus, and you can't breathe without pushing yourself up. And that's why you could never sleep. You couldn't slip into a coma. And if you wanted to hasten death, you'd break their legs, so they couldn't push themselves up. But the point is, it had to be lingering. It had to be public. Had to be just outside of a main gate. That's a choke point. People are going to have to go by there. Had to be high enough that people could see it, and so on. But most importantly, to the Romans, it had to be, and this is my term, but it had to be publicly certifiable. Because the Romans would not tolerate the possibility that the rumor would get out that the poor wretch had somehow survived the ordeal, and now the sedition could go on. So there was a requirement that before a seditionist, was taken down off a cross. Now, time out. There are examples in history, in the history of this era, where the Romans, they were enraged at the destruction of Jerusalem. They just crucified everybody. And there was no care about that. But if you're talking about a judicial crucifixion, where a man has been turned over as a seditionist, Jesus wasn't convicted. We'll talk about it next year. He was exonerated, but he was turned over to be crucified as a seditionist. And in that case, there was a protocol that before he came down off the cross, there had to be public physical demonstration of his death, and that's the spear. Now let me draw you a parallel, see if this helps with this one. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead in John 11, he very carefully, he contrived to arrive. Remember when he heard about it, he waited for 2 days? And he arrived on the 4th day. Remember Martha says, no, don't roll that stone back. It's been 4 days. Well, the universal protocol in the Jewish world was that when a man died, you could attend to his body for 3 days, and you started counting the day he died. So that's day 1, day 2, day 3. By the time the sun goes down, on day 3, you seal the tomb. Now, I don't get into it too much, but these tombs are usually caves, and they've been hewn out as a tomb, and they're used generation after generation, and bodies are but the point is that there was a table. When you carved that tomb, you left a stone table, and the body would be laid there, and for 3 days, starting the day he died, you could come, and friends would come, and it was very important, and they would take that perfumed, they would take cloth and tear it into strips, and they'd soak it in perfume, and they would wrap his body. There's no mummification. They never took any steps to retard decay, but what they are doing is trying to keep the smell down, because you want to be able to minister to him for 3 days, and it starts to stink right away. You're in a little tiny cave. And so when Jesus gets there, it was last night that the tomb had been, you roll that stone across there, and you kind of chink because what you're doing, Jews did not normally bury in cemeteries. They're buried on the back 40 somewhere. And it's a workspace. And that body's going to be stinking for weeks. And so you want to kind of seal it in there so you don't have to live with that. And so now and so Lazarus' body has been laying there for, I don't know, several, 12, 14, 16 hours in that little tiny tomb, and the smell would have been horrible. And so much so, you remember Martha, who I always kind of say, is this fair to say she's kind of the Martha Stewart of her own day? She's little Miss Homemaker, right? She's always watching. And it's a terrible faux pas to subject people who have come to minister to you to that sign of, and so she's horrified. And Jesus insisted. And I think as they began, the men doing it were probably covering their nose, and people were backing up and so on, because that stench would have rolled out of that tomb. And Jesus contrived to get there after that stench had begun to develop. Why? Because you can't counterfeit a death stench. And when that came rolling out of there, you absolutely... See, the reality of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is entirely dependent upon the reality of his death. And there was physical evidence. What the death stench was to Lazarus, the sword in the side, was to Jesus. There had to be, I think it was important that he be lifted up, because by Roman protocols, there's going to be absolute physical evidence. And I'll tell you something, you didn't have to be there that afternoon to see the blood and water. As soon as you heard, you live anywhere in the Roman Empire, as soon as you hear that that man was raised up and crucified, you knew he didn't come down there until he was a dead man. And therefore, when he 3 days later rises and for 40 days shows himself alive by many infallible proofs, there is absolutely no question that it's a genuine resurrection. Does that make sense to you? So I'm saying, I think Jesus kind of orchestrated things and carried himself in such a way that he would die at the hands of the Romans, be lifted up, because only then would the reality of his... And by the way, we've talked about this before. How does God prove true a man's claim to be a divine messenger? Miracle. What's the greatest miracle in human history? Jesus walking alive out of that tomb after 3 days. And that's what I love what Paul says in Romans 4. According to the flesh, he was the seed of David, but he was demonstrated. And I better read it. I started off on Romans chapter 1 and verse 4. Hugely important verse. Let me go there. Here, Romans 1 and 4. Jesus Christ our Lord, born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and here it is, declared to be the Son of God with power. Now, declared there, that word in verse 4, is actually our word horizon, horizo. And I think the idea is it was spread across the horizon, from earth to sky, from east to west. It was emblazoned across the horizon. He was declared to be the Son of God with power, undeniably, by the resurrection from the dead. And the great seal, God put his seal on everything Jesus claimed concerning who he was and what he had come to do. And the way he put his seal on that was the resurrection. But the resurrection is only a dependable fact to the degree that Jesus genuinely died. All right, I'm going to stop with that. Any questions or comments? How much time we got? I used up more time.
It's 5.
It's 5 o'clock. It's no ball game. I'm trying to remember. We do have supper. Anybody? If not, that's fine. I must have been so crystal clear. No, I didn't. Honestly, I hope it's been a help, and I love doing it. But yeah, there is no more worthy focus for your study hours than the life that Jesus lived. And